May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. Advent is a time of pregnancy, a time of anticipation. And we feel this anticipation as we get together with friends and family, decorate our houses, make cookies, shop for presents, listen to our favorite songs of the season, watch corny holiday movies. And some of us are just trying to get through the season and waiting for it to be over. But for us as Christians, Advent is about the anticipation of celebrating the birth of Jesus, God's Son, and the anticipation of his coming again. And it's about God coming to be with us, bringing forth new life, even in the messiest moments of our lives. Joseph is facing one of those messy moments. Mary, betrothed to be his wife, is found to be with child. While we are told it is by the Holy Spirit, it appears that Joseph doesn't necessarily know this. Or perhaps Mary has told him and he has his doubts. He's considering breaking it off. This is a more gut-wrenching and complicated situation than breaking off an engagement would be in our time, in our culture. Betrothal, unlike engagement today, was a legal contract between families. About a year would typically pass between the making of this contract and the actual wedding. It was much more serious and legally binding than what we think of as engagement. If someone else was the father, as Joseph clearly suspects, even though they were not yet married fully, Mary would be guilty of adultery. Mosaic law dictates that she would be stoned to death. At the very least, if Joseph exposed her as unfaithful, as bringing shame upon her family and his, she would be shunned by her community. And Joseph is terribly conflicted about this. He's a righteous man, which suggests he's faithful to the Mosaic law, but he's also compassionate. He does not know what to do at first. I couldn't help comparing my engagement to Joseph's situation and contrasting it. When we were engaged, Janice was found to be with child, and this was not by the Holy Spirit. And our parents were somewhat scandalized, but most people we knew pretty much took it in stride, even in the church. We had been talking about a wedding in June. This was December. And I called Father Lindsay at Christ Church. I think Merle remembers him. And asked him about moving it up to March. He said, well, that's during Lent, and we don't do weddings during Lent. We're pregnant, I said. Well, without missing a beat, he said, well, then we'll have it on a Sunday. And just hypothetically, let's say the father had been someone else. My calling off the engagement would not have been anywhere near as fraught with danger as Joseph doing so. All that is just to illustrate the cultural differences between our time and theirs where it comes to these matters. It's truly a messy situation. Matthew sets us up for this hint of scandal in a passage right before this, in the genealogy that precedes the story of Joseph and Mary. Not surprisingly, Matthew's genealogy is not in our lectionary. You can just imagine why, because, so-and-so begat so-and-so, and it's boring, right? But there's some very interesting details sprinkled in with first of all, it sets up Jesus as a son of David, at least legally, as the son of Joseph, having a royal lineage. But sprinkled into the list of fathers and sons are a few women, several of whom are associated with scandal. We have Tamar, who dressed as a prostitute to deceive Judah into fathering a child by her. Rahab, a prostitute who aided Israelite spies in escaping from Jericho. And Bathsheba, whom David took as his wife by having her husband Uriah killed in battle. And you may remember that Nathan, the prophet, just issues a scathing denunciation of David over what we might call Bathsheba Gate. But by alluding to these stories of tainted women, Matthew sets us up for the messy, potentially scandalous situation that Joseph finds himself in. I'm sure all Joseph expected was to settle down with a nice Jewish girl and raise a family. Mary's expectations must have been similar. Instead, we have scandal and shame. Yet God is at work in that very scandal and shame, bringing about no less than a new creation. In fact, Matthew alludes to the original creation story in some fascinating ways. First of all, when he says the birth of the Messiah took place in this way, the word translated birth there is actually Genesis, which would have been familiar to any Greek reader of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, as the name of the first book, as it is in our Bible, Genesis. And he uses the same word, Genesis, in introducing the genealogy that I was speaking about. Joseph and Mary also stand in contrast to the first couple, Adam and Eve, in interesting ways. You know the story. Both Joseph and Mary obey God's will where Adam and Eve disobeyed. And just as Eve was the first to disobey, Mary is the first to obey God's call to bear the Son of God. Where Adam passed the buck, right, the woman gave me the fruit and I ate, Joseph takes responsibility. And if you grew up with the King James Bible, you are familiar with where Genesis says Adam knew his wife and she bore a son. That's knowing in the biblical sense, right? A Hebrew term for that. Matthew actually uses the same Hebrew expression when he says Joseph knew her not till she had brought forth her firstborn son. Where our translation says had marital relations. So, very interesting parallels. Enough of the nerding out on here. Anyway, and one last thing. Remember what happened when Adam and Eve ate the fruit? Whereas before, they'd been naked and not ashamed, their eyes were opened suddenly, and they sewed clothes for themselves from fig leaves. And shame is a big factor in Joseph's quandary. But God's grace overcomes the shame and scandal of Joseph's predicament. One more personal story of pregnancy. This was a few years after we had our first child. We decided to have a second one, and we had an ultrasound. These were not as routine as they are now, but Janice was a couple of months along, and we hadn't had one of these before. So we asked the technician to explain what we were seeing on the screen and what all those gray blobs are, right? And he says, well, there's one head, and there's the other one. Excuse me? What do you mean the other head? Do you have a two-headed baby? Well, of course it was twins. And once I stopped hyperventilating and they peeled me off the wall, I was fine. But that story gives me a little appreciation of the utter surprise that Joseph and Mary encountered. How totally unexpected that an angel should reveal to Joseph that the child will be known as God with us and that he will save his people from their sins. How audacious of God to enter history in this small village in Judea among an oppressed and occupied people, in this ordinary couple, a carpenter and his wife-to-be. How unexpected that a birth in a humble home in this small village would bring wise men from afar to honor him. And in that humble birth is the beginning of a life that would change the world in ways that Mary and Joseph could not have imagined. God comes to be with us in so many surprising and startling ways, reconciling us to God and each other, binding us together in forgiveness of sins and fellowship with God. God comes to be with us in ways that can totally upend our own expectations and that can have impacts far beyond our knowledge. One of my favorite recording artists, Bruce Coburn, has a song about Joseph and Mary, and I love the refrain of this song. Like a stone on the surface of a still river, driving the ripples on forever, redemption rips through the surface of time in the cry of a tiny babe. Sometimes God comes to be with us in spectacular ways, like the conversion of Paul on the road to Damascus. Very often it happens in seemingly ordinary ways, as when unexpected and maybe undeserved kindness is extended to us, or when we extend it to others. And these acts can ripple out, spreading and spreading in their impact, far beyond our own awareness. All these moments of grace are signs of God's coming kingdom, where all things are put right, where the harm of the original sin in the garden is undone, where the world's values are turned upside down so that the greatest are those who serve the least, and where sorrow and weeping are no more. At the beginning, I described Advent as a time of pregnancy. Our lives are pregnant with God's Spirit, full of something waiting to be born. Where might God's surprising grace be present in your life, even in the mess? What is waiting to be born in your life today?